Hello, glad you guys to come stop to visit again. Pastor Doug here to share with you another folk tale. Hope you're enjoying them as much as I enjoy telling them. It's always hard to tell stories when you don't have an audience around, so I'm glad that you're here with me. This is another Jacktale, and this one is called Jack Joins the Army. Now, a long time ago, whenever Jack was getting to be a little bit bigger, but not big enough to know that he wasn't too big, he was starting to look at the world around him and trying to figure out what he might be one day. Why, he thought about maybe being a farmer like his daddy was, or maybe being an adventurer like his brothers seemed to be turning out to do, or maybe even the next king. He just had no idea what he wanted to do, but his mind was always a looking and probing around trying to figure out what it might be. Well, as his chores were, as you learned before, he had some pretty hard stuff to do. Why, he had to help his mama out around the house, and that meant he had to chop the wood, and he had to make the fire and haul out the ashes. He had to draw the water in the creek and bring it on up to the house, made sure everybody had something to drink, good and cold, work in the little garden they had, all kinds of chores. But as I'd said before, his favorite chore of all was going into town ever so often to get a sack of beans and some cornmeal. The reason he liked going there, because he got to go to Mr. Hemphill's store. Now, the reason he liked Mr. Hemphill's store wasn't because of all the beautiful toys that had arrived from the East, because they didn't have no money for such things. But he loved going there because sitting on the porch was Mr. Webster. Why, Mr. Webster was always a-sitting there. He had his old corncob pipe in his mouth, a-rocking back and forth, and he was just looking at this checkerboard sitting on this pickle barrel, and you would have think he was ready to make the next move that was going to win the game. The only thing was, he wasn't ever playing with anyone, so Jack knew he couldn't be playing a game because there was no one there to play with. But Jack would sit there and watch him, and it looked like he was ready to choose and go and crown and all the things that you might do. And as he noticed Jack coming up there, why, he'd start telling stories. Jack loved that the most. Why, he'd tell stories about victory and valor. He'd tell all the stories that were around. By the way he told him, you'd think he was the very one that banished the witch of Jonesboro, or he might have been the one that got the king's men back away from them giants. Why, he had all kinds of wonderful things to be doing. And as he told those stories, Jack's mind got full of all kinds of things that one day he might get to do. Maybe he would be a giant killer, or maybe he would go and rescue someone from the witch. You just never know what's going to happen to a little old boy as he is a-growing up. Why, he'd always go on in, and by the time his mind was full of all kinds of stories from Mr. Webster, why, he'd pretend on the way home that those beans were like gold nuggets, and he was carrying gunpowder instead of old flour, and he'd be making his way back through an enchanted forest with all kinds of ghouls and goblins and witches and giants and all sorts of fellas, the things that might happen to him. And by the time he got home, he was panting and having a great time because he had had a marvelous adventure. Well, one time, whenever Jack was taking care of this regular chore of his, he got close to Mr. Hemphill's store, and when he got real close, he noticed that Mr. Webster wasn't there. Why, he just thought to himself, oh, this is going to be a terrible day. Why, I had to work all the way down here, and now I'll just have to lug that stuff back. But when he got there, he went on into the store, and Mr. Hemphill said, oh, Jack, did you hear about the king's men? He said, no, I hadn't heard no king's men. I'm not even sure what one is. I mean, there's a king always got this fellas helping him and stuff like that, but, what are you talking about? He says, oh, Jack, that's where Mr. Webster's at. Why, he went on down to Mr. Thompson's field whenever the prince's army come in. Why, they got all down there, and they got all their tents set up. They're going through all their drills. If you haven't seen a kingsman, an army fella like that, boy, Jack, you ought to get down there and take a look. Well, I'll hold these goods for you right here. You get on down there. When you get back here, I'll send you on home. Well, Jack couldn't think of a better plan, and so he went on down to Mr. Thompson's field, and sure enough, there was Mr. Webster leaning up against a post, just gazing off into the field at them men. Why, Jack had never seen anything like that in his entire life. Those were the most handsome men and shaped men he'd ever seen. Why, they had great plumes up on their helmets, and everything was polished and gleaming in the sun. Why, they had their chin straps, and they had their breastplates, and they had their buttons, and their boots, and their swords, and their muskets, and they had everything going on, and they just looked right. And when he got down there, the sergeant was calling out drills, and every time he'd call something, they'd just snap to, and they'd go into motion, they'd come around. They would do everything they were supposed to do when they were supposed to do it. Why, Jack saw them all moving this way and that way and getting in this formation and going between and back, and he was just mesmerized. And he just sat there and watched. And the more he watched, the more amazed he was. After a while, Mr. Webster says, "Now, Jack, that's the way a man ought to live. Out there going on great adventures, fighting for the king. There's no telling where these men are headed to do something wonderful for the kingdom. And why, I tell you what, someone who joins the army is someone everybody looks up to." Well, Jack started letting that roll around in his head, and by the time he got to Mr. Hemphill's store and on up to his house way up in the mountains, he had already pretended like he had been a soldier and in battles and all kinds of wonderful adventures. And when he got there and he was telling his mama about all the things that was going on and all he had seen and that wondered about that day, why, his mama just said, "Oh, Jack, why, you're just too little to be going off into the army or something like that. Why, you shouldn't even be thinking of such things. By the way, what would I do around here if you wasn't here?" And Jack started to thinking to himself, "Well, that's probably right, Mama. I'm kind of glad I am here, but boy, maybe one day I might be a soldier. You wouldn't mind if I went down there and watched them again. I'm sure they won't be there for very long. They got to get out to their battle." Well, Jack's mama, being the good woman she was, why, she got up early in the morning and she got some things together and sent Jack on his way and said, "Well, you can go all this whole week if you like. Just go down there and see them men and just watch what they do." And so Jack got down there, and no matter how early he arrived, well, Mr. Webster was already beating him down there. Well, they'd get up there and they'd just sort of lean up against that fence and watch the men drill. And all of a sudden, Jack didn't know what he was doing, but he just started doing what the men were doing out there. Why, whenever the drill sergeant called to attention, Jack found himself going to attention. Whenever he called him to turn, he was turning. Why, everything he was doing exactly like them soldiers. He was counting out his steps. He was going about face. He was going this way and that way. Why, there wasn't nothing that he couldn't do that them soldiers was doing. And let me tell you, them soldiers noticed little old Jack. Now, every now and then, he'd get his feet tumbled up together because he didn't want to be looking down at them while he was marching around. A couple of times, he'd fallen into the fence and knocked things over, and Mr. Webster, why, he didn't even crack a smile. He'd just help little old Jack up and say, "Why, that looked pretty good. Just give it another try. You're going to get there. Why, you're looking just like them soldiers out there. Maybe one day you'll be out there with them boys." Why, day came after day, and Jack got better and better. He got so good that the soldiers themselves noticed that Jack was over on the other side of that fence doing everything that they was doing. And they thought it was the most wonderful thing they'd seen. And one day, toward the end of the week, one of them soldiers had called Jack over. Jack couldn't believe it. They'd noticed him. They'd seen what he was doing. And they called him right on down. He got out there and he got over there, and the king's men just started talking to him. Says, "Oh, Jack, we've been watching you, and why you can do everything like we can, and why we just was wondering if you might want to come out and drill with us on the field tomorrow morning. You see, tomorrow morning is going to be the last day we're going to be around here before we go off following what the king wants us to do. We've been drilling and we've been working, and now we're ready to go into the battle. And we just got to scrap together a bit of a uniform for you, and if you'd wear it here in the morning, we'll let you go ahead and drill with us." Why, Jack couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe his good fortune. And so he put together that old scrap of a uniform, and he made his way on home that night. He tried to fit it all on when he was telling his brothers Will and Tom and his mama all about getting to march with the soldiers the next day. And he got it on there, and sure enough, the sleeves was a little long, and there was a tatter here and a tear there, and it was way too long because it was built for a man and not a boy. And so his mama, being the good woman she was, why, she went to mending on that thing that night. She must have stayed up the whole night, but in the morning when Jack got up, there was a uniform that was just right for him. It fit him nearly as good as anything he had ever worn in his whole life. And right next to it, his brothers, not about to be outdone of being good, had carved him a sword that he could put right down by his side, and had him a nice bit of a wooden gun that he could carry with him. Why, Jack was so excited he put that together, and he just found himself marching all the way into town. Why, he just put one and the other, and he found himself making nice sharp turns. It was everything that he could do. Why, by the time he got himself all ready, he got himself down there early, and they was still eating breakfast. Why, they called Jack on in, and they just marveled at how he looked like a soldier. And they started to tell him, well, if you're going to look like a soldier, you ought to eat like a soldier. And so they gave him some of the grub they'd been cooking up, and well, it wasn't as good as his mama's cooking. It sure did taste good to be sitting around with all them soldiers getting ready to go drill. Well, whenever it came time to drill, they all got lined up, all of their different regiments, all their different sections, in each one and every column in every row, and at the very back they put little old Jack. Why, they put him back there, and whenever you looked down a row, well, you couldn't really see him because all the others Kingsman was right in front of him. They figured he'd be hidden back there pretty good, and so they let him go. And that's whenever the sergeant come out. He called them all up into attention, and whenever they came into attention, that's whenever the sergeant turned around and introduced the prince. Why, the prince had ridden over the night, come in the morning to inspect his troops, and he was a-telling every one of them that he had come there to look at them and to commend them for their hard work so that he could lead them into battle. And he was ready to review them, to watch them as they showed just how good they could go through the movements that would be called on them to be able to go against the enemy. Why, they was excited about it, except for them that knew that little old Jack was back there. Why, they was a little bit nervous of thinking that maybe he might get out of place. They surely didn't want to get in trouble in front of the king's very own son, the prince himself. Why, they got together, and whenever the sergeant turned around and started calling his orders, they just started a-marching this way and that way. They started doing their drills, and every time Jack was exactly where he was supposed to be. And now, every now and then, because it was a pretty long drill, there was a couple of soldiers that might be out of step, and so they'd have to cover up. And they'd have to get back in order. And whenever they was out of place, why, it left a view back to little old Jack. But by the time they got themselves covered, he was covered up again, too. Every now and then, whenever the drill sergeant was turning around to talk to the prince about what he was calling on the men to do, why, if there was anybody that was got a sore arm or they'd gotten their gun not quite right, they would get it and adjust it until the sergeant would turn right back around. Why, everything was good until the very end of the drill, whenever the prince was about to give his commendations for the best of the best. And whenever he did, he gave out medals, and he gave out honors, and he gave out awards that were earned by the soldiers in their time of preparation. And as everything was coming to an end, that's whenever the prince said, "And I want to know about the young cadet at the very back of the back. I noticed him, and he was always where he was supposed to be, and I don't really remember someone like that, but I can't wait to use him in my army. Why, we could use him as a messenger going from one section to another. He doesn't look big enough to be in the heart of the battle, but we could sure use him on our side right now, because he could be a part of this army, and I know he's going to be a good one." And that's whenever the sergeant turned around to the prince and says, "Oh, sir, I know everybody in this army for you. I know their name, and I know where they sleep. I know how well they take care of their uniforms and their guns, and I know everything about them so I can help them get to be the best that they could be. And I hate to tell you, but that little old cadet back there is not one of yours, sir. You see, there's a little old local boy that's been a-watching, and the boys took a shining eye to him, and they got to liking on him, and then they gave him a uniform so he could drill with them today, and he's just out here for the morning. He's going to get on back to his home. I'd like to say he was one of your men, I would. He's a good little old boy, and one day he'll make a fine soldier, but I tell you, he's just not ready yet." Well, the prince had everyone dismissed, but he asked if he'd call Jack up into his tent. Jack was pretty nervous to be called in before the king's son. He got himself up in there, and when he did, there was a little place for him to sit. And as he sat down and looked up at the prince, why, the prince come out, and he called Jack into attention, and Jack went into attention. He called him everywhere he was supposed to be and what he was supposed to do, and he just did all the drills right in front of him. And that's whenever the prince's son said, "Oh, I've heard your name was Jack. And it's a good name it is because it fits you well. Why, it shows that you can do what you want to do. And I don't know what you've ever been thinking about what you might do one day when you grow up, but you just might be a great soldier. Why, you got a uniform that looks great. You got everything that you need to be a soldier at this point, except for one little thing." And Jack said, "Oh, what's that?" He says, "Well, in order to be a soldier, a kingsman, why, you have to pledge your allegiance to the king. You just have to let everyone know that you are going to live for him and fight for him and stand for him and follow his orders and obey his commands, and that you are going to be where he wants you to be and do what he wants you to do with all your soul and all your might. And all you have to do is give your allegiance. And if you do that right now, why, I'll just take you along with all these soldiers when we take off, and you can start being a soldier now. Now, I know you still got some growing to do, and you can do that. And as you grow, you can watch the men around you, and one day you'll be the finest soldier in the king's army because you'll know no other way of living than his." And that's when Jack actually started thinking about his chores. He'd never thought about his chores in a good way before. He started thinking about what would happen if he wasn't around to do them. Why, his mama would have to go down to the creek and get the water herself and carry it up to the house. She'd have to chop the wood, and she'd have to clean out the ashes. And why, she was already doing so much around there, just getting them together and making sure they had clean clothes and food and everything else she did around there. Why, she didn't have time to do the stuff that, well, what Jack did. And so he just looked up to the prince and said, "Oh, sir, I want to be a kingsman one day. I think I really do, but I just can't do that right now. You see, I got to go home and make sure that I take care of my mama while I can, and one day I'll be gone, but right now I think that's my place. I think I need to be back there with her and doing what she wants me to do." And that's whenever the prince's eyes begin to glow with a red that he'd never seen before. Why, he just looked at Jack and he said, "Well, if you're not going to be one of my soldiers, then looking like one's not any good for you." And so he just reached down and he grabbed hold of Jack and he ripped off his uniform and pulled it aside. He took off his boots and he ripped them too, and he broke his gun and his sword and throwed it off over in the fire, put on some old rags to him and says, "Well, if you're not going to be one of my soldiers, I just need you to know that looking like one isn't going to do you any good. One day you're going to have to give your allegiance to the king, and you're going to have to live for him, and there's no turning back when you do that." And Jack didn't want to do that. And so he was pretty sad. Why, he went out of the prince's tent, and the soldiers noticed that he'd come out with no uniform, just some old clothes that the prince happened to have. And as he made his way across the field, Mr. Webster wasn't there. Nobody would say hi to him or anything, afraid that maybe they'd get in trouble for even acknowledging that they'd brought Jack into this whole business. Jack climbed over the fence and made his way on into town to Mr. Hemphill's store, and sure enough, there's Mr. Webster, sitting there in a rock and back and forth with his old corncob pipe, just tapping it away. Oh, Jack got up there and looked at Mr. Webster and said, "You're not going to believe what happened. I can't hardly believe it myself." "Oh, I just don't have to go on any further, Jack." He said, Mr. Webster said, I saw. I was up there. I was so proud for you. Why, you were the best soldier on the field. You should have seen yourself, Jack. Why, you were exactly where you needed to be. You was never off to the right nor the left. You was never out of place to the front nor the back. You was always everywhere you were supposed to be. You heard every command and you obeyed every command. And why, you looked just like a soldier. He said, "Well, that's the whole thing, Mr. Webster. I mean, I was a soldier for a day. Can I just tell people I was a soldier for a day?" Oh, Mr. Webster started thinking about that and said, "Well, I'd like to say that you was a soldier for the day, but at least as far as I can remember, there's only one way to be a soldier, Jack, and that's giving your allegiance to the king. If you don't give your allegiance to the king, it really don't matter if your thing's not quite right. It doesn't matter if your boots aren't so shined as they should be, or your uniform's not quite fit, or you're out of line one way toward another, or even if you are not the best shot or the best defender or anything else. First and foremost, now you want them things to be the best that you can, but the best thing is to give your allegiance to the king. And that's how you become a soldier, even for a day." Jack went on home, and when his mama got home, she was so proud of him when he began to tell his story. Why, his brothers Will and Tom, why, they started just imagining how Jack was out there in Mr. Thompson's field, looking like a soldier and doing everything that they was doing. And whenever he got to the sad part of his tale about what the prince had done, they just shook their head and said, "Well, I'm sorry that happened to you, Jack, but it's a good lesson to learn. Everything that we'd heard is true. You just can't be a soldier unless you give your allegiance to the king." Now, I hope you enjoyed that story, and I tell it to you because of a thing that Jesus said to a man who had come to him. Why, he'd come to him and said, "Jesus, I want to follow you, but first let me go back and take care of some things at home." And that's whenever Jesus told him that he was not fit for the kingdom. Because anyone who was going on the plow and they turned and took their hand off of it to do something else, Jesus said was not fit for his kingdom. And I don't know about you, but that's one of those hard teachings. Because sometimes in our lives, there are lots of other things that we want to be doing rather than following our Lord, the God's only Son. And we have to get our minds right so that we can give our allegiance to the King, that we might follow him. And that is the end of that.